Hi and welcome. I'm Lisa Fain, CEO of Center for Mentoring Excellence, and here in my capacity as an ambassador to the International Mentoring Association board, here for our series of interviews with mentoring experts, and thrilled to be joined today by Melissa Richardson, who is the founder and managing director of Art of Mentoring. Art of Mentoring is a specialist mentoring firm that's based in Australia and offers a range of products and services for design and implementation of effective organizational mentoring, including program management software and digital training resources for mentors, mentees, and for program managers who administer the mentoring programs. Melissa is one of Australia's experts in coaching and mentoring. She's worked in the field for over 20 years and has designed and implemented mentoring programs across public and private sector organizations. She's at the forefront of the use of technology to support mentoring programs that span geographies. I'm excited to talk to her about that today. She's also a global assessor for the EMCC, the European Mentoring and Coaching Council, which is a sister organization for the IMA, and has postgraduate qualifications in organizational coaching, counseling, and marketing strategy. She directs the Art of Mentoring's research agenda and speaks on mentoring best practices. Melissa, I'm thrilled to have you here today. Welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So I'm excited to dive right in. I know you've done a number of studies and research studies on mentoring, and I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit about those, why you chose them, and just tell us a little bit about those studies.
Sure. We try and do a study each year. So we choose a topic that seems topical or interesting, and we dive into it. So we began with right back in the beginning, probably 2015 was the first year, we started doing benchmarking of what organisations were actually doing in mentoring, because there wasn't a lot of data around on that. And then we moved into a study right when the Me Too movement was happening. We're very interested to see how that was going to impact particularly men's willingness to mentor women. So we did that study in 2018. Last year we did a study on intergenerational mentoring, and we've just completed another study this year which hasn't been released yet, but I can talk to you a little bit about that later.
Great, I'd love to hear about that. I'm particularly interested, just to start with, on the what you found in terms of your kind of post-Me Too study about men's willingness to mentor women. What are some of the insights from that study?
We got very interested in this. There was a study done in the US on this, on what was happening, not specifically around mentoring, but what was happening in the US around men and their willingness to engage with women in the workplace after that, all that media storm that was happening around the Me Too movement. So we started looking at this, and we surveyed people across, not just Australia, we had quite a few people from other countries complete the survey. And we were able to replicate the findings of the US study, although it wasn't quite as strong in Australia as it was in the US. So we started to look at things like, how do people actually limit themselves? What are men and women saying about themselves when it comes to things? The characteristics we chose were things that typically are associated with holding women back in the workplace. So underestimating abilities or performance, or feeling like an imposter, the old imposter syndrome. What was interesting, if you look at this slide, is how high those bars are for men. So the blue bars are the men and their responses to our survey. The purple bars are the women. So whilst some of these are higher, most of them are higher for women than for men, I think we were quite surprised. For example, nearly 60% of men also said they underestimated their abilities or performance, which is not something we typically associate with men. And I think it's because we don't ask them these questions. In fact, when we put this particular part of the surveys together, one of our team members asked me, "Have you made a mistake? You're asking men these questions." And we thought that was telling in itself. Why don't we ask men, for example, have you ever had to make a choice between work and family? That's the third one in. And you can see there, it's actually higher for men than for women. The other part was, we looked at, okay, are they willing to do things with their female counterparts? And there was about a quarter of men saying, no, actually, right now I don't want to be in a room alone with a woman. And that has obvious implications for mentoring relationships. So we found that quite interesting. Let's see what else we've got. We asked men and women what they would most like a mentor to do if they were your mentor. And we were particularly looking at, were there any differences between the genders here? So we found some small differences there. I just need to move my little control panel out of the way. Hopefully I'll be able to do that without turning the slides off. Here we go. Women were more likely to be seeking understanding of their strengths, their unique situation and obstacles than were men, although that was also quite high up their list. Look at express confidence. Sorry, I've just moved my cursor. We'll do that again. Look at express confidence in you. Yeah, interesting, isn't it? So this is something that's typically associated with women, a lack of self-confidence, and women seem to want to be seeking their mentor to actually express confidence in them and give them a confidence boost, if you like. Similar issues around
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, I'll just tell you where that brings up for me, Melissa, especially when you look at it in contrast to the point that you raised at the prior slide about men having imposter syndrome, is that, you know, the consequence of imposter syndrome might be different for men than it is for women in terms of what the need is or what the expectation is externally before they move forward. It's really fascinating to me.
It is fascinating. This was a quantitative study, so we didn't actually conduct any focus groups. It would have been interesting to explore that a lot more deeply, but we didn't. I think on the next page you're seeing a few more differences too. Women are much more seeking sponsorship within their organisation than men. What else is interesting there? Yeah, look at that third from the bottom. Teach you how to play by the rules of the game. Men are much more inclined to want their mentor to do that than women are. I think women are a little bit more reluctant to acknowledge that the game exists and there are rules, and you know, they don't want to play by the rules of the game because that's the man's game, perhaps.
Yeah.
So those were some interesting findings. We also found some interesting insights here around, well, what was it that men and women found comfortable or uncomfortable about mentoring? So we saw here on the slide before, teaching her or him the rules of the game. Both genders are saying, well, actually, I'm not really comfortable with doing that. I don't really know how to go about that, actually. In fact, we looked at both how uncomfortable they were and whether they felt incapable. So this issue of the rules of the game came up for both, really. Affirming her or his sense of self-worth as a woman or man. I don't know if you've read Brad Johnson's book, Athena Rising. He talks a lot about this, that affirmation is really important, particularly for women. And yet mentors are saying, well, I don't really know how to do that and I feel a bit uncomfortable doing it. So those were, I mean, there was lots more, obviously. Yeah. Those were the key insights from that piece of research.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, tell us a little bit about this intergenerational data that you surfaced.
Yeah, so this one we did last year, and it was a little bit different in that we did both focus group and survey methodology, which gave us, I think, a much richer and deeper understanding of the issues around this. So what we wanted to look at was what are the differences between the generations real or are they stereotype? And how does that play out in a mentoring relationship? So the first thing we did was quite a lot of desk research to try and see what had been published and written about generational stereotyping. And we were really unable to find any real research evidence to suggest that there are real differences between the generations. Mostly it's stereotype that we carry in our minds. And it's very hard not to have those stereotypes because we're being fed that through the media all the time. Mm-hmm. So some of the key findings from that study, and we talked to 3 generations. We talked to baby boomers, Gen X and the millennials or Gen Y. We didn't include the generation before boomers, and we didn't include younger than Gen Y because we really just want to look at the dominant group groups in the workplace at the moment. We did find that some of the mentoring needs really are quite universal, but boomers and Gen X expect a bit more challenge from a mentor, whereas millennials are looking for respect and interpersonal skill building. So these are just the highlights. I can delve into this a little bit more. Generation X is really, it was interesting talking to the Gen Xers actually. They were the ones that called themselves the bridge. They talked about in the focus groups, we can be a bridge between boomers and millennials who maybe are so different they don't know how to talk to one another. So we think that's a really big opportunity, particularly in terms of mentoring, to make sure that Gen X isn't forgotten. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a sec.
Yeah.
The next finding that we thought was quite important was there was nothing in our research to suggest millennials actually want high technology options when it comes to mentoring. So just like anybody else, they do actually want, if possible, a real relationship to be built and, if possible, a face-to-face connection. We also explored the notion of reverse mentoring. And for most people in our focus groups, there was a lot more interest in reciprocal mentoring than in reverse mentoring. And these focus groups were with HR practitioners, I should add, not just people of different generations. So we were looking at what did organisations see as opportunities. Was reverse mentoring something that would really help to break down barriers between the generations? And we found actually, no, people didn't want that, but the idea of co-mentoring or reciprocal mentoring was something they really wanted to explore. So we have quite a few clients now experimenting with that with some quite good results.
So Melissa, is the reciprocal, that expressed desire was a desire that was expressed by all three generations of reciprocity versus reverse mentoring?
We explored that primarily with the HR practitioners.
Mm-hmm.
I would say most of the HR practitioners were boomers and Gen Xers, not quite so many millennials.
Right.
Yeah, so we didn't explore it with so there were two different types of surveys that we had and focus groups. What were the universal mentoring needs? These were the four. Just having a different perspective, having a sounding board to test their ideas, a mentor's experience, guidance and advice, being able to grow their networks and increase their networking opportunities. So nothing surprising there. But this idea of challenge is really interesting. So back in the women's study, we were really surprised that challenge was the number 2 need that people had of mentoring. We often, you would do the same, Lisa, when you ask a room of people, what do you expect from a mentor? They'll say, someone who listens, someone who'll give advice. And there'll be a whole range of things, but challenge is rarely number 1 or 2 that come up in that kind of conversation. So we were quite surprised by that. And there was a generational difference here. It was one of the few differences that we actually found was baby boomers and Gen X are much more open to challenge and actually are looking for challenge from their mentor, whereas millennials are looking for respect. They also seem to acknowledge their lack of interpersonal skills. So there's the stereotype, right? The millennial stuck on the phone, really glued to technology. They seem to understand that may be holding them back when it comes to being able to make genuine connections and build interpersonal skills. So we found that really very interesting.
That's fascinating to me.
This is, the mentoring bridge. So I mentioned before the boomers and millennials and the fact that Gen X themselves were perhaps the bridge between them. And when we started to think about it and look at, what are some of the studies around what's happening with Gen X, there is a feeling already that Gen X is starting to be overlooked, that boomers, who are still primarily the leaders in the workplace, at least they were when we did this study, and this is only a year ago, get a lot of support and organisational investment, if you like. Millennials who, and even younger graduates coming in and the younger people get quite a lot of support, but it's the generations in the middle, you know, the middle management layers that often miss out on investment in their professional development. And so we want to make sure that we don't overlook Gen X in mentoring. So we don't necessarily want to skip them. We don't want to say, okay, let's see if we can use mentoring to open up intergenerational dialogue. So let's pair boomers with millennials and skip that Gen X generation. So the concept that we were really putting forward is have your boomers mentor your Gen Xers and your Gen Xers mentor the millennials. And in that way, you're kind of passing the baton from generation to generation. Sorry, I went forward then. It does put a bit more burden, if you like, on the Gen Xers, because they've actually got to do both. They've got to both be a recipient, they've got to be a mentee, and they have to be a mentor as well. So having more of those mentoring relationships. We've just had a client finish an intergenerational mentoring program. They called it Gen to Gen, where they deliberately paired people up in this fashion and told them it was going to be a reciprocal relationship, but one of the parties would start in the mentoring role and the other would start in the mentee role, but there was an expectation that at some point they would flip and start co-mentoring. And it's worked really well, has really opened up interesting dialogue between the generations.
And when they flip, does the initial mentor-mentee relationship stop and a new one start, or are they happening sort of concurrently?
Yeah, they just they start off one way, but then you know, and individual pairs will have done it differently. So they might have swapped each meeting. So, okay, I'll be the mentor this meeting, you be the mentor next meeting. But I think, and we haven't gone into all the data yet, I think probably what happened more is it became a mutual exchange within a meeting.
That's wonderful.
So it'd be interesting to hear.
Yeah.
So I think that's the last slide, but I'm happy to answer any more questions you have.
Yeah, tell us what's next on your research agenda?
So because we have a mentoring platform, we have data, and I don't think this has been done before. We actually did some data mining and looked at answers to application questions from mentees and mentors, and then answers to survey questions at the end of a program. And what we've done, and obviously we're looking at anonymised data, we're finding some interesting insights around what mentees say they need, what mentees say they have to offer and what they want to offer. They're not quite the same, particularly at the beginning of the relationship. And also, you know, the impacts. We've got some really large sample size data around what we all know intuitively, and we might have small sample size data that says mentors get as much out of it as mentees, but we've now got some really good data on that. So we'll be releasing that at the end of this year. In fact, probably within the next month or two. Yeah.
Great. So for those who may not know, we're recording this mid-July. So have a look for that. How can people find out about that study once it's released?
Look, all our studies are on our website, which is artofmentoring.net. So if you just go to the library, you'll find all our research reports there.
Great. Well, thank you for this work. It's so exciting to see, you know, to see this quantitative research and think about how it will form, how it will affect what we're doing in the field of mentoring. I know for the people watching, it's really illuminating as well. So, Melissa, thank you for your time, for your expertise. We'll make sure that there are live links to your website in the notes when we post this video as well, and really appreciate your time.
You're welcome. Nice to be with you.